Hello, Atmore. It's the Lloyd and Friends show. And now here's your host, Lloyd Alberton.
All right, this is Lloyd Albriton here on the Lloyd and Friends show, and this morning I'm talking to a good friend of mine, a local fellow that many of you know. If you've ever been in trouble, you might know him. He's an attorney here in town, but not just an attorney. He does a lot of stuff. He writes. He's a historian, and you read him regular in some of our local publications. I won't steal your thunder on that, Kevin. Just giving him a little intro here. But I've got Mr. Kevin McKinley with me this morning. And we're going to talk about some of the things he's doing. How you doing, Kevin?
Doing good. It's great to be here this morning.
Now, Kevin, you I've known you for a few years, coming and going here. Gladly. You've never had to defend me in court, but
we do a lot of things.
I try to keep your address in my book just in case I ever get locked up.
Just in case
I have somebody call. I have a brother that's a lawyer, Greg, of course, but I can never get a hold of him. I told Greg I've got enough garbage on him from childhood days that if he doesn't start returning my phone calls, I'm going to start publishing some of that stuff.
Politics.
But anyway, Kevin works here in Atmore. He's a practicing attorney. And Kevin, have you lived here all your life? So why don't we start with just tell me a little bit about where you grew up?
I was born out in Canoe and raised out there and grew up in this area, and also we're really technically residents of Monroe County. With Eureka Landing up there's we got a place up there. There's a lot of great people there and at Canoe, and we kind of split our time back and forth, and it's just we're fortunate enough to kind of hang out at two locales, I guess you'd say.
Now, when you say we, you're talking about your family's roots.
My wife and I, and my mom and dad. My grandfather moved here in the 30s. He was from Monroe County, and he moved to where we're at in 1936, and bought 80 acres out there during the Great Depression. Lost 40 of it. A lot of what's now on Howard Page Lane over there was some of what he owned at the time, and. But the Great Depression was what it was. It was rough on a lot of people, but he held on to the South 40 side of it, and there was a washout. It had a lot of erosion on it, and they farmed that place with mules, and they put terraces in it, and brought it back and made it a productive farm again. And there's still all kinds of I call them relics from where he was out there. Different farm implements, and had an old barn that was roofed with turpentine cups. When he got out of the turpentine business, he beat them flat and made shingles for them. And
made shingles out of turpentine cups.
Yeah, it was and that old log barn stood until just a few years ago. And as a boy, I thought it must have been some kind of, some kind of metal you bought at the hardware store back in the day. And maybe it had fell out of favor over time. And I was asking my dad or somebody about it, and they said, no, those are turpentine cups. When he retired from doing turpentine work, he beat the cups flat and made them into shingles. And there's just a lot of things out there that he would do that way, fashion his own way. So
how about that? Hey, can I interrupt you right there, because you just kind of nipped at a little interest. When I was a boy growing up out in the woods out here in Nokomis, a lot of the landowners did turpentine. People, when they had those cups, they put them on there. And you'd have turpentine out to the country store. We used to go out to Hubbard's store out on Highway 31, and they had a pump over there. People would buy turpentine. I guess they burned it in heaters or
Well, it had a lot of different uses. And, one thing that made this area so wealthy back in the day, back in the 1880s and 90s, was what they called the Big Cut. And there were two things about it. They were harvesting virgin pine timber,
right,
and making a fortune off of it. Then there were also turpentining, and you could be, you could come down here and be the poorest guy in the world and not have much more than the shirt on your back. And if you worked hard in a few years, you could be extremely wealthy and have a house on Belleville Avenue in Bruton off of turpentine, because it was going out of the port of Pensacola and other ports too. But Pensacola was one of the major ports, and they shipped it all over the world, and they used it in all kinds of industrial and textile applications. Now it's mostly synthetic, so there's really no call for it. But you go back in these woods deep enough around here, you'll still find trees that are cat faced, where they cut it.
They scraped them and
the scrapings, and the neat thing is a lot of those old trees are petrified now. So I found a few of those on our place that I say they're petrified anyway. They're extremely hard and they're old, and I've recovered a few of them and kept them in what I call the McKinley Museum of family history, so to speak. So
so they don't do the turpentine off the trees anymore?
To the best of my knowledge, they don't. My dad told me probably.
I haven't seen that in years. I wondered.
Well,
whatever happened to that?
My understanding, there was someone in Walnut Hill doing it as recently as 1980, but I think that's long since gone as well. So no one's really. My dad had told me about the fellow that was doing it in Walnut Hill, and that was probably 10 or so years ago that he told me that in conversation, and he said it was like last he knew that was in early 1980s that stopped. And apparently maybe Armstrong in Pensacola was still buying it back in those days, but all of that's no longer going on to the best of my knowledge. There may be little pockets of it somewhere, but nothing like it was in the 1890s.
It was everywhere. I remember one time my father was building a little, he was building like a hog trough. They had a little, it would just have a little angle, and you would pour the slop into it. And he was building a hog trough, and to seal that hog trough off, he told one of us that, he said, "Lloyd, go out there in the woods and get me one of them turpentine cups." And he would pour that turpentine cup in there, and then he would light it and kind of fire, and it would burn off, and it would seal his pig trough. Oh, I was fascinated by fire, as all little boys are, and I went out in the woods one day and got one of those turpentine cups and lit it and set the woods on fire. Oh. In fact, my mother had to come down and put all that out.
Oh, gosh. So did you get in trouble over that? So.
Well, Daddy didn't. I don't think Mama told Daddy. I think I got off with that one. But I would have been in big-time trouble.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories around canoe that are kind of related to that.
But I do remember the turpentine. There was a little fellow by the name of Willie Harris. I don't know if you ever knew him. Willie dipped turpentine. That was hard work, real hard. He would, you might have a truck, or he drove an old wagon, and he'd have these barrels. He would dip it. I don't know exactly how he did that, but he would dip it out of the cups and put it in a barrel, and then he would lift those barrels up on the wagon. I don't know how much turpentine you can dip in a day, but Willie worked without a shirt, and you'd see him out in the woods, and he would be so tanned it looked like he had a leather jacket on when you see him walking.
It was hard work.
It was very hard work.
Well, and a lot of these the turpentine camps, as they called it, existed around here too, and some of them we don't know where they were, but there was one out in Robinsonville, Waubee area, that they tell me that the base of it is still there. It's like a huge concrete base about the size of a room. They said the boiler's set up on it, and that's somewhere along Sizemore Creek, supposedly. And you had that out there, and you also had, there was one turpentine camp, they called it Ridgeway, and I don't know where it was at, but Ridgeway must have been a heck of a place, because the newspapers around the turn of the 1900s, that is, they were constantly reporting on, like there would be a gambling den going on out there, and someone would get shot, or it'd be a drunken brawl or something of that nature. And so this was a turpentine camp where this was going on. Usually they were so far away from, municipalities that there was no law enforcement, and they were just kind of almost like the Wild West, but in the woods of South Alabama.
There was an old fella, he's passed away now, he was a preacher, named Ralph Johnson. Did you ever know Ralph Johnson?
I don't think I knew him.
I think he was from down around Perdita, but he preached all around these parts. In fact, he was called himself a funerals specialist. He had preached over like 600 funerals in his life. He kept them all in a little book. And Brother Ralph could make them cry. I mean, boy, he could blow the walls down, or he could tone it down. And anyway, he was just a super guy. But he did a little history. He started off his early life in the woods, dipping turpentine, dragging logs out of the woods and all of that. And he did a little historical project of wood about transportation, and he went all through. He didn't call them carvings, but they were woodwork pieces of different transportation pieces, like the stagecoach, or how they would drag, the oxen would drag, and he had over 100 pieces, that artistic pieces.
I remember that, yeah, because you'd see it at William Station.
It used to be
back in the early days of it.
His children have that, and I just recently talked to one of his sons, Dale Johnson, who had several of his pieces at his house. I was wondering where these pieces were, but he did a little exhibit on the old VHS tape. It wasn't great quality, and he gave me one of those, and I took it to Pensacola, and I had it transferred over to not a DVD, but a disc. Which are out of date now. We use thumb drives now.
Yeah.
But somewhere here I have that, and it's just really fascinating with him sitting there narrating all these models and what they did.
He may have also been the fellow that was on the one of the local papers interviewed him. It must have been in the 1990s, and I remember reading it and just being really fascinated by it. He was talking about how in the old days you could wave down a train and it would stop and pick you up, and you could pay them a nickel to let you ride to the next stop or wherever you were going. And I just remember that was just so foreign to anything we know today. It caught my attention. So
yeah. Well, now you're talking about, I want to go back to the land just a minute, because my brother told me, Greg, he used to do land appraisals, so he was kind of up on some of his research of doing land appraisals. He told me my grandfather originally came up to this part out of Conecuh County and acquired 80 acres. He homesteaded. Now, this was back not in the 1850s when we had all the homesteading, but this was like after 1900. And he homesteaded 80 acres up here, and Greg was trying to figure out, I didn't know they had homesteading that late, but he figured out all of these railroads, people gave them a land, like miles on either side of the track.
Right.
And a lot of them went bankrupt, and all that land, they let that out for homesteading. Are you familiar with that?
Well, I've seen they'd have to run an ad in the paper. They'd have to run notice in the paper that it was almost like an affidavit saying that they had lived there so long, and they'd have certain witnesses that would sign too. I've seen that as late as probably the 19-teens in the local newspapers, and I think sometime in that time period Congress passed an act that ended it, or something happened, and they stopped it. But there was still some of that to that point. Matter of fact, on a related note, there was even a lawsuit in Escambia County, Alabama. Probably in 1915 or so, somewhere in that ballpark, give or take 10 years, I guess, and descendants of Spanish landowners from when this area was part of, the Spanish crown, they were suing to try to recover all of that land that was lost, and there was this huge lawsuit, and no one really knows what the final resolution of that is. It had to have failed, or either that, or maybe they received compensation for it, but none of that land went back to any of those that I know of, went back to those Spanish descendants. But that was a big lawsuit. No one knows the outcome of it. So that's kind of goes along with homesteading. Yeah.
But now you came up out of Monroe County then. That's where your family...
That's right. Most McKinleys in this part of the world end up being related, and they come from... There were two brothers that were in Milledgeville. Well, I'll go a little bit further back.
Okay.
If you go back to early 1700s to mid 1700s, McKinleys were in Scotland, and they pretty much fought against the British. They were always on the kind of the rebel side of causes, so to speak. And the Battle of Culloden, which was a big watershed event for the Scots and the Brits, that was the equivalent of their Gettysburg. And when it was over, the British embarked upon what today would probably be considered like a genocidal thing. They outlawed the kilts. They imprisoned a lot of the ones that had sided against them. And then they sent other ones to Ireland. They sent a lot of them to the United States. And there was roughly estimated to be around 100 McKinleys that were killed at Culloden. But in that time span, my group came over, and they ended up in Georgia at Milledgeville at one point. But there were two brothers there that fought in Andrew Jackson's army, and they, after the war was over, they went back to Milledgeville, and this fellow paid them to drive a herd of cattle to Monroe County, Alabama, and the guy never showed up for the cattle, and they stayed, and they both had huge families with a lot of males to pass the name down, and so it pretty much proliferated from there. So then you get down to late 1800s, early 1900s, when these timber companies like Kearney Mill and Atmore and Alger Sullivan, as they cut over all this timberland, they would sell it really cheap. Because if you think about it, it's smart. They cut the timber, they make money off of it. They mill the lumber, and then they sell you the land really cheap. So you'll buy it and build a farm. And where are you going to buy the lumber from? Probably the same person that sold you the land that had cut the timber originally. So a lot of people came from Monroe and Conecuh and Clark County and other points north and bought land, like my wife's ancestors. They were Glasses, that was their last name, and they had a dairy at Walbeek, Glass Dairy Road. Well, he come from Marengo County. Octagon was the name of that community, and he moved here around 1915, 1919. It wasn't homesteading under the legal definition of it, but what it was is it was buying what was probably really inexpensive cut over timberland, because you could buy that land for, very inexpensive. Even by their terms, it was inexpensive.
Right.
So,
Well, now, this whole development was, okay, so they cut the timber off, then they sold the land, the farmers built on it and bought the lumber. A little bit later on, we started looking at mineral rights when oil and gas, with the car coming out in the early 20th century with fuel. When, as an attorney, you probably have an answer. When did that start of separating mineral rights? Because I know a lot of this land was sold off, and the wealthy oil people kept their mineral rights.
I would say now, and I'm really
the
not.
Millen
as,
family is one of those.
Yeah, I'm probably not as up on that as some are, but if I had to guess, I would say you're probably talking 1930s, 40s time period
late. Okay.
in this area, maybe before that. But I think timber rights were a big thing at one point, and the turpentine rights, I guess you would say. But when you get into, like, I think when they I think it might have been Fanny or Pollard where they first struck oil around here, and after that, I think it was on after that. Everyone had a keen interest in mineral rights, and after that period. So, yeah. But it was farming before then, and even with that, this area kind of developed a little different than the way it appears now. Fruit orchards were a big thing, strawberries. Satsumas, and really, I mean, I would dare say that if you were setting in this spot 100 years ago, you probably would have been setting in a Satsuma orchard, or maybe even in rows of strawberries. The McMurphy brothers, McMurphy Oil. They've told me before about like the Barrentines and other groups. Of course, potato farming was big too with them as well. But even before that, though, you had all of this on the south end of Atmore. A lot of it was Satsuma orchards, and you had people talk about climate change, but the climate really got a little colder here at one point, and the Satsuma trees in that age just were not adapted to any kind of cold whatsoever. And the growers also faced a lot of competition with the orange growers and like California and places like that, and Florida, I guess. But had that taken hold here and held sway, I think this area would look a lot more like South Florida than it, or Orlando, or where orange groves are more prevalent than the way it looks today with the agriculture. Because in those days they were trying to get away from cotton. There were articles.
Cotton depleted the soil, didn't it?
Well, it depleted the soil, and at one point I've read in some of these local papers in the 1920s where it actually cost more to plant it than what you could get out of the crop at the end of the season. So, and of course, that's kind of turned around some now. But you had, the boll weevil was a big issue with it, and there were other issues as well. But they were farming was definitely different. So they were constantly trying to find other crops that they could diversify into, like ramie. I don't know if you ever heard of ramie around here or not, but ramie was kind of like silk in a way, but it was a fiber, almost kind of like, I'd say, a cross between silk and twine or something, and they experimented with growing it out around the state farm, and they actually built a plant in Atmore. As best I can guess, that plant was somewhere around the area from about Church's Chicken to that railroad track that's back there, and they were going to develop it into rope, and they were going to sell it to the U.S. Navy and other sources. But it was a very flammable process, and the plant burned. The first crop I think they had in this area burned up in a fire over there, and then they started making cigarette wrapping paper with the Ramey, and that lasted for a few years. And then by the late 40s, they just decided, this is going nowhere, and everybody just kind of gave up on it. But that was an attempt to get away from it. You go out to
so farming has evolved quite a bit in this area.
Very different, very different. You go out around Dugout, which is out there kind of around between Canoe and Walbeek. There was a huge farm out in that area that was vineyards, satsuma, strawberries and stuff like that. That was a huge area, and they had fruit packing houses out there, and they also had one of the worst train wrecks in the state of Alabama ever happened out there. They had a fruit packing house that was on the left on Dugout Lane when you make that when you come off of the railroad bridge there, where the railroad goes under 31, you make that first right, and if you look to your left right there when you cross Dugout Lane, there was a huge fruit packing house there. It had a railroad switch that ran up in it. Some worker left the switch turned, and a passenger train come through at high speed and ran into that switch and hit that fruit packing house and killed the supervisor, who was I want to say his last name was Hardy, if I remember correct. And there was a young boy that was working there that was killed too. And that was, at the time that happened, that was the worst. I think it was the worst train accident to date in Alabama, and it made news as far away as California and everywhere else. People came from all over. When the word got out, cars were still relatively new, but if you had a family member that was on that train and you were in Daphne or Mobile, you hopped on whatever they had for roads and came up here to try to retrieve your family members or check on them and see if they were okay.
Where'd you get this keen interest in history? Have you always been on that track? Or?
Yeah, I think as long as I can remember, even as a kid in school.
Where'd you go to school?
Well, I went to. I had the good fortune of going to the Methodist kindergarten, and then I went to A.C. Moore, then the middle school. Really loved the old middle school there in Atmore. I went to the high school in Atmore, and I went to EA for some time. But, when I was in school, I really didn't care a whole lot.
You went to high school, the one over here now.
Yeah, I loved reading, and I loved history. I didn't really care for a whole lot of other stuff that was in school. Math I wasn't very good at and stuff like that. But one thing I did like was history, and I would consume it in large volumes, and as well as anything to do with writing and that sort of thing. And I was on a school paper over here back in the day, and we actually won some championships, so to speak, back in those days. Not due to my writing, but the team as a whole. And Miss Bell, Wynell Bell, was the faculty sponsor of that back in the day.
Okay, yeah, I went to school with Wynell
back in the late '80s, early '90s.
Miller.
Okay. Yeah, that was a lot of fun back then.
Yeah. Now, when did you graduate from school?
91.
You're what age now?
I am 50.
50.
Yeah. So
well, time flies, doesn't it?
It sure does. And it seems like it flies faster every day. So.
Now, where did the law come from? When did you decide you want to go into law?
Well, I had always wanted to be an attorney, but we were not. We didn't have a lot of money growing up. We my dad always worked hard, and he provided for us.
What did he do?
Well, he was a first-rate carpenter. When he came out of the Army, he started framing houses and actually had his own crew at one time. He was very good at that. He decided at some point he wanted to go over the road, and he bought a semi, and he had a few trucks, and he did that. And that was a very tough line of work, but it was a very necessary work in the economy. So you always had a job, and you always had somewhere to put your truck at, and I did that for a while too. I owned one myself, but then I went back, got an undergraduate degree, and then went on to law school from there, and just kind of never let up. So
where'd you go to law school?
I went to Jones in Montgomery.
Okay.
So yeah, and I was in the first ABA accredited class that come out of there. So that was a big deal to us because they had went through a lot of hurdles to get that approval. So it was an interesting and stressful time to be there, to say the least.
Then you came. Where'd you go to undergraduate school?
I went to Faulkner University out of Montgomery, and then I worked with Ernie White for a while, and then I opened an office in Atmore.
I was going to ask you that. You worked under Ernie for a while.
That's right, and then I opened an office in Atmore, and then I opened a second office in Monroeville. So right now we have two offices.
You're still running the two offices.
Yeah, we've got the one.
Do you have somebody over there, or you working with, or do you go back and forth?
Well, the Atmore stuff, my wife kind of, like I said, we've done a lot more at home since my parents have had some health issues, but we've, my wife kind of handles a lot of stuff, so to speak, from a hub perspective, intake of calls and stuff. And then I go to the Monroeville office several days a week, and I'm in Atmore, and then I'm in court so much, and I'm licensed in Mississippi, so I'm kind of all over the place.
You don't have an office over there, though?
So, no, not over there. So not over there enough to really have one, but I'm over there somewhat frequently. So,
Well, I'm just assuming, since you have so much knowledge and background in real history and real estate, do you do a lot of real estate transactions, or you do a lot of criminal, or what do you specialize in anything?
Well, it seems like it's a lot of criminal defense, a lot of domestic relations work, and a lot of in those areas. And I do capital murder defense, and there's a lot. You have to do a certification for that. So there's every area has a few attorneys that do that. Every area is kind of known for.
Oh, you got to be certified to do a capital murder.
Oh yeah. You have to have done so many trials, and you have to go to trainings, and you have to stay abreast. With different changes in the law and stuff. It's a complicated area.
Well, I can imagine that it is. TV leads us a little astray on that, don't they?
Oh yeah, that's probably.
I mean, a young guy comes out of college and he grabs his first murder case.
Yeah,
that don't happen.
That couldn't happen in a capital case, or it shouldn't happen, because you have to have those, and the courts and the judges, they want to make sure that they have the certifications to properly represent those people in that situation, and that's a big part of it. You have to get that, and you have to have done so many trials and that sort of thing. So,
what is the going back? And you've been practicing for a few years now.
I think it's about 17, if I remember
17
right.
years. What would you do different? Would you go with a bigger town and with a bigger firm to learn the ropes, or would you start like you worked for Ernie, but it wasn't long. You kind of hung out your own shingle.
I guess I'm stubborn or whatever, but I probably would. It's hard to think what I would do differently. I'm sure there are things, but right off the top of my head, it's kind of hard to say. It's, I've been very blessed to do what I do, and to be able to be where I'm at and everything. So it's kind of hard to say that what I would change. I'm sure there are some small things that I would, but it's you just get out there and do your best, and life just kind of takes it from there.
Do you enjoy what you do?
I do. Or
does it sometimes? The stuff you see, I can only imagine that sometimes you might get a little
when you can do something for somebody in a legal context and help them maybe fix a problem that they have, or perhaps if it's a situation where you help, let's say a set of grandparents get custody of a child, and maybe the parents have some substance abuse problems, or you help someone get out
a mess,
or
really
help someone
get
their substance abuse problem worked out, where they can go on and have a productive life. When you can see something productive like that come out of it, there's really nothing else like it. And I tell people I would much rather represent them once and have them help them get things worked out and straightened out.
Not have to come back with the same old problem.
And see them in Walmart 5 years from now, and they tell me how good things are going, because it's far more to it than money or politics or anything like that. It's finding a redeeming value in something you do. You want to believe that, or at least I do. I want to believe that you help someone get their situation straightened out to make the world a better place for them and their family and their future, because they're going to hopefully have kids or get their kids back or whatever, and you want them to be strong, productive citizens, and so it can build a stronger country. And so I like to. That's really, I didn't go to law school necessarily to try to make a lot of money or anything like that. I went to law school to try to help people, and that was because I saw a lot of things in, people around me, and also just community at large, and I just wanted to try to accomplish something better than just the status quo, so to speak. So.
A lot of lawyers who go to law school never practice law, or they maybe practice a while and they go into maybe politics, or a lot of politicians are lawyers. What are your thoughts on that? Have you ever considered where your path is going to lead you, or are you going to just keep on doing what you're doing?
When I was in undergrad, we had an instructor who had also been an attorney and went to law school, and he said the average attorney practices for about 7 years, and then they find something else to do. But now, I can't say that I've actually seen that in my years of practice around here. I mean, it's most of the attorneys I know many of them have practiced longer than I have, and a lot of them haven't. So maybe I'm right there in the middle. But that's what we were told in school, and there is a lot of segue into other things that people get into doing that. For some reason, a lot of lawyers also become writers, or like to write as well.
Well,
So,
Grisham's a good example of that.
That's exactly
Spun
right.
a little small town Mississippi attorney practice into a major
And William Faulkner, who did
writing
not
career.
practice law but did attend law school, I think, for a little while, if I remember right. It's Sunday afternoon, and I've had a big lunch, so I might be remembering wrong, but I think William Faulkner as well might have been an example of that. He didn't finish law school, but I think he went to Ole Miss for a little while. So
Well, writing, I would just imagine, is a major aspect of lawyering.
it
I mean,
is.
it'd be kind of hard to write up your cases and stuff if you didn't know how to express yourself, articulate, and so forth.
Well, that's true too. In writing briefs, and I've done some appellate work too. So and that's sometimes that can be. But there's a big difference between legal writing and writing something
telling a story. Or
yeah, something that you really want to sit down and read from a entertainment
perspective.
Yeah, one's far more technical than the other, but I think maybe it gives you the ability to maybe see things in a different way, so that you're more observant on some level, possibly. So it definitely creates a different outlook on life and on.
Well, probably the same way with a policeman who becomes a writer. Joseph Wembow comes to mind. He used to write back in the 60s and 70s. That used to be a TV series called Police Story on TV.
I remember that. I remember
He wrote a lot of The New Centurion, The Onion Fields, a lot of books. But he was a L.A. detective, and spun it into a.
Well, that's like Jack Webb that wrote. I think that was his name. Wrote Dragnet and
Jack Webb, yeah.
Adam 12.
Adam 12, produced those shows.
Emergency. Yeah, he was in that mindset, and when he died, they gave him I think he had a police, law enforcement
badge. Yeah, they made him
he had
official.
A badge, and a LAPD had a special detachment at his funeral. So
yeah.
But it's really funny if you watch old Dragnets on METV at 4:30 in the morning, which I sometimes do. It's the same issues that we deal with now. They were dealing with
same stuff.
Yeah, in the mid to late 1960s. Same. I mean, all you got to do is change the clothes into more modern apparel, and it's the same. It'd be the same shows all over again.
I used to love Jack Webb. In fact, one of the he made several movies before he got into the television Dragnet stuff. One of them, he played a Marine drill instructor.
I could see that.
It was called The DI, was the name of the movie. And, of course, I was in the Marine Corps, so I love all these military Marine Corps type movies. But I think he might have been a Marine drill instructor, actually. But, boy, he was good at it, with that way of talking, that staccato machine gun way that he could talk.
Yeah, because on Dragnet he'll talk in that, like you said, that staccato style. When he's
just the facts, man.
Yeah, just the facts. Yeah, that's his catchphrase. Yeah, so great show though. It's I'll watch it a lot of times before I before I start the day in the morning or something. So
Yeah.
it's a kind of a neat show.
So now you do some writing. I know you write for the Atmore magazine. I see your columns in there, and you write. Are you write for the Advance? Still,
Well, no, the Tri-City Ledger.
You're writing for the Tri-City Ledger. Okay.
Yeah, I've had a column in there for January was 17 years. So for a good while, I've had a.
How do you find time to dig up all those stories?
Well, it's really not as
Time consuming.
Either that or it doesn't seem that time consuming. I don't know which it is, but you just kind of get on a trail and see where it goes. And sometimes it may be a story takes years to actually fall into place. You get one little bit of information and you just kind of lodge it away in your mind somewhere, and then.
But don't you have to get out there and do some research, like go digging through the graveyards and things like that?
Sometimes.
But you enjoy doing that.
Well, yeah. One time, Sandra and I will go to, like, say, the William Station Cemetery, and we did this, and we took we wrote copied names off of headstones, and then went and researched them on Ancestry and newspapers.com, and kind of found their life stories and put them back together. I'm working on one now that a lady that reads my column, and she's over around Jacksonville, had bought she loved flea markets, and she bought a box several years back that had some old dog tags in it, some old letters, and she was telling me that she would really like to see if anyone in that fellow's family would like to get that stuff back, and if I could kind of research it and find out a little bit about where it might be. Well, come to find out, this is a developing story, so I don't know the total answer to it yet, but he was a naval aviator, and he was shot down over Wake Island in 1942, 43.
Yeah, is that the same one you were telling me earlier?
That's right. He survived. He survived, and he came back and married and had children, and he died roughly around 20 years ago, and his family formed a foundation that makes charitable contributions since he passed. But she just simply wants to see if they want these materials back. I know myself, if someone called me out of the blue and said they had something to that effect and were just wanting to give it as a gift to the family, that's a very unique gift that you could get. So we're trying to see if we can track down a direct descendant that may be interested in that. So and they're scattered all over the country. The family is. So we're going to have to do some digging, but I think that'll be a good story at some point, hopefully. And we also went to some ghost towns. When I say we, my wife and I, because we both like doing that. But there's a ghost town almost on the county line between Escambia and Covington County and the Florida state line there. We'll go to places like that and just kind of dig up information and make stories out of it and stuff. So
now, do you the objective of a lot of your historical research, is it more history, or is it go into family history? In other words, do you do a lot of family histories on your own family? Well,
really both. It's really kind of some of the above, and it's local history and all, because you think about digital history, like online and everything.
Right.
It's good and it's there and it's a very good research tool, but who's to say how long it could be there? If different political whims prevail and different spheres of influence, you might find an article you can find today, and 10 years from now it might be scrubbed from the internet, possibly, if it offended the wrong group or person or something like that.
Right.
But you look at old newspapers, almost every week a newspaper's printed is going to be stored at a probate court or a library or some other place that is usually tasked with keeping track of something like that. So just like you can go and pull a Bruton Standard from 100 years ago at the courthouse in Bruton, you could or some similar paper,
right.
You'd be able to do the same thing, hopefully, with one of our papers 100 years from now, assuming there's still a world by then. But so that's kind of the advantage, and I like trying to preserve that because, especially local history coming down the pipeline, there's not a lot of print material on a lot of that stuff. So unless you get it from the old papers or the oral tradition of talking to senior citizens and other folks that may know it, you're not, it's not going to be there. or it may not be there.
Atmore published over at the Advance back. It had to be. It was called the Millennial, so it has to have been 2000 or so. It was a wonderful publication. It was a big, thick of all the compilation of all the history.
That might have been also
It was a great publication.
Well, in '76 they did one.
That's
did,
when it was.
But I think
it was 76.
Didn't they reprint it in 2000 or at some later
no,
point? It was
no,
just 76.
I don't know where my mind was thinking, but it was 76.
Yeah.
I guess the 1776.
Yeah, my mom and dad got me one of those for my birthday when I was 9 years old, and that was I remember my dad and I went to the Advance and got it, picked it up. So we're talking 1980, must 80, 81.
Right in there.
Something.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, you couldn't have gotten probably a cheaper present that was more enjoyed by somebody, because
that was a wonderful publication. That goes to show you what happens when we start getting old, Kevin. My grandpa used to say, I'd sit on the porch with him, and he'd say something happened the other day. I said, well, when did you mean, like last week? Oh no, it was like 1922 or something,
Yeah.
And now I'm doing the same thing.
Yeah, I catch myself doing that too. But yeah, that was an amazing bit of compilation. I wonder where a lot of those photos ended up that were in there, because
and this Thomas McMillan Museum. Now I talked to Don Sales on this program for another station, and we did an interview with him, and his interview is on my YouTube channel, by the way, as well, Don Sales. But I went over and visited. He showed me around the Thomas C. McMillan Museum, and even years before that. This was probably back in the 1980s. I have a brother who's an artist. I don't know if you know my brother Philip.
I don't think so.
But we were doing a project back then. He was doing it, and he was doing these art exhibits, historical art exhibits, to where we would take, say, a family. You go to somebody like one of the Swift people here in Atmore, right? And old Grandpa Swift that started the first little sawmill, and he had an old mule named Jasper, and we would look at these pictures, and my brother would put together this composite drawing of who that person was, and the pictures were just fascinating. So I went over and talked with Bob McMillan at that time. Bob's passed now, but the McMillan family, their father was Tommy. There's a Tommy E now, Tommy Jr., I think. But Bob hooked me up with that museum back then, and I looked through a lot of those old cuttings and stuff. It was just fascinating. The whole thing about Sheriff McMillan getting killed, that's all in that. Railroad Bill, all of that. But and this was old hard copy newspapers but they had archived and captured a lot of that history. Yeah, and it's over there.
Well, and locally, there was a fellow by the name of R.W. Brooks, and I'll mention his name almost any time I get talking about history somewhere like this or at presentations. And the reason he's so interesting is because he came to this area in the late 1860s.
What was his name?
R.W. Brooks. Brooks Memorial is named after him.
Okay, I see.
And before that, it was Brooks Chapel. But he came to this area from Butler County, worked at a sawmill town that was between Waubee and Canoe, which is no longer there. Bowman Cemetery kind of marks the area. But
right.
He was very well read. He was very well written. He was a local preacher. He was a magistrate. He was a newspaper writer. Also, at some point, owned a box plant. I mean, he was just into so many different things during his lifetime. But he lived here from the late 1860s until he died in the early 1940s. And so he saw this area grow from kind of being right on the edge of the frontier days to almost modern. He even wrote, sometimes mentioning about Highway 31 and stuff like that. And to me, he is individually responsible for preserving a lot of what we know about this area, because he also wrote a weekly newspaper story for years in the Atmore Advance and the Atmore Spectrum and the Flomaton paper. He would write in all of these, and he would tell these stories about being around here. One of the stories he tells is about John Wesley Hardin, when Hardin was hiding in this area, and how he knew him when he was at Bluff Springs, because Brooks lived at Bluff Springs for a while. But one of the, I believe it was Sheriff McMillan's wife, was related to
Hard.
well, she had a brother, Brown Bowen, and that was I think and anyway, Brown Bowen was brother-in-law to John Wesley Hardin, and they were hiding out over there together, and I believe the sheriff's wife may have been some kind of cousin to them or something. Anyway, there's some kind of kin connection, so don't hold me too closely to that. But anyway, they all knew each other pretty much, and it was an amazingly small area where all these folks were, they all knew kind of who each other was, and a lot of crazy things happened. But Brooks wrote a lot about knowing John Wesley Hardin and about how he was. You would never believe he was an outlaw just talking to him. He said he had more of the air of a college professor than he did a.
Well, he was a lawyer too.
Yeah.
He went to law school.
Well, while he was in prison, after he was captured over here and sent back,
he became a lawyer after he went to prison.
Yeah, he became a lawyer after he went to prison. When he got out, he opened up a law office in El Paso, I think.
Well, he had a pretty bad mean streak in him. Didn't he kill like 20-something people?
Well, Brooks says that when he was drinking, that was when he was dangerous.
I see.
When he was, I believe that's what he said in one of the stories. But he killed some. It was way on up there, And before he came here, he had killed several in Texas, and then he fled over here, and then there were stories about at least one person over here being killed by him, supposedly by him and Bowen.
But he never hung, did he? He got out of jail, didn't he, and went on to be a citizen?
He went out and he became an attorney for a very, very brief practice because allegedly he ticked off someone in El Paso. I think it had to do with a female, as that sometimes does happen. And the guy's dad, the guy's father, came in and shot him in the back of the head in a saloon in El Paso, and the jury acquitted him of the killing. And they asked the jury. One of the big issues was he shot Hardin. The bullet come out of his eye. So the story in this pre-forensic world was: did it enter the eye and come out the back, or did it go in the back and come out the eye? How did this killing happen?
Right.
And they asked the foreman of the jury, whoever, how did they reach their decision? And they said, well, if he shot him face to face and the bullet went through the eye, it was self-defense. If he shot him from the back, if he shot him in the back of the head, it was good judgment. So, because of who he was dealing with. So,
right.
So they let him go, but that ended
they made a John Wesley Hardin movie. You'll never guess who played John Wesley Hardin in the movie.
No, who was it?
Rock Hudson.
Really? Huh.
Yeah, I remember seeing that movie.
I think if they ever made another movie about him, they would not have to embellish much, because a lot of that was just, it was, you just can't make that stuff up, as they say.
Well, in this part of the country, my family grew up out in Nokomis, out here south of Atmore, Florida. Of course, Nokomis is Florida and Alabama, kind of crosses the line. But if you're in Florida, the law was in Pensacola. And, people lived out that way. They would go to town, get their seed and groceries. They'd go to Atmore. They didn't go to Pensacola. Mm-hmm. But it was in Florida. And my father, who was a pretty prolific storyteller, used to tell me about some of the characters around here. And I would ask him, well, how did they get away with so much? They were just like these Western outlaws. Some were bad men. And he said, well, the law was out of Pensacola. And they didn't send the law up here for just anything, all the hog thieving and stuff like fights. They didn't send the law out. They didn't have enough people. And so they just got away with a lot. They just didn't want to deal with it, And he told me about some pretty bad characters here. Alcohol and bad behavior have always kind of run together. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you see a lot of that.
Even in biblical times. Yeah.
Even in biblical times, yeah. You're going to find drugs or alcohol at the bottom of it somewhere. They were both drunk or something like that. Well, following World War II, living out here in the country in Nokomis where I grew up, a lot of moonshining going on in those days. A lot of people you may not even know their names. They were moonshiners. And this was old rot gut stuff they drank, but over in Nokomis area, there were a lot of men, World War II veterans, that would just become drunks. They didn't go to any meetings, so they didn't call them alcoholics back then. But they would just stagger up and down the road with an old bottle of rot gut whiskey in their back pocket and just drink it straight. And naturally, they'd fight. Yeah, some of them they'd shoot one another.
Well, it was a different era too.
It was a different era.
A lot more testosterone around.
Yeah, and the alcohol.
Yeah,
There's some heavy stuff. In fact, out there's a little church out in Nokomis called Antioch. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Just a little cinder block church. And the folks' community used to go to church out there, and it was sort of historically more Pentecostal than anything. So there was a lot of loud preaching and jumping and shouting going on. But a lot of the men would bring their wives to church, and they would be outside in their wagon, and they'd be out there smoking and drinking and telling stories, and usually end up in a fight. So he said it wasn't unusual to be right in the middle of church. Some couple of guys would go to busting through the door fighting in the church.
Wow.
But it sounded like quite a circus back in, just like the Old West, in fact. Yeah. There were a lot of guys like John Wesley Hardin down this area.
Well, and, Great Depression.
Like Railroad Bill, people.
Oh, yeah. In Great Depression, in that era, moonshining was a secondary occupation. I mean, some people were doing that to try to keep their head above water. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's stories of Monroe County all the way, through any of these areas where it was, fairly common in that range. But I guess it faded out over the years, and so probably better enforcement.
Well, even though it should have been obvious, you would think that people that drink so much, you have a lot of child abuse, wife abuse, and things like that. They didn't have all the studies we've got now. It wasn't really frowned on that much. Most men drank. Most men smoked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, smoking was probably, the 50s or 60s before it was determined to be dangerous.
Before I even started talking about it, And back in World War II, and this was happening even when I went in the service in the mid-60s, we still got our seat ration packs. They always had 3 cigarettes in each seat ration pack. And during the war, young boys would go off to war, and they would be out there in the mud and the blood, and they'd get their seat ration pack, and they were hungry. They'd eat every dab of it, and there was those 3 cigarettes, so a lot of them started smoking.
Yeah, pretty common.
So, the tobacco companies really made hay on the GIs after World War II, and after the war, everybody smoked.
Yeah, and it was different brands too. If you ever noticed that, it wasn't the same brands you see today. They were. It
was different. Yeah, it didn't have the filters on them. They were
Lucky Stripes and Chesterfield.
Camel. My mother and father used to smoke Camels.
That's right.
No filters on them.
Yeah, no filters. Yeah,
strong Camels. I was a kid that liked to pick up Daddy's cigarette butts and smoke them out behind the building. Fortunately, I don't know how I missed it, but I never took up smoking. but my parents did smoke earlier. In their lives. They quit later on, but...
Yeah, I never picked up that habit. My dad smoked a good part of when I was younger, but then later in life, he quit. He got away from it and moved to chewing tobacco, I guess. In his mind, that was a good medium, middle of the road, but some would say it's not. But anyway, that was his choice. So.
Right. Now, Kevin, your wife, her sister is a friend of mine who's recently completed law school, and I think Hayden Sizemore.
That's right.
And Hayden's living up in Montgomery area there, and I guess she's practicing with a larger firm. Did she go that direction?
I think she is solo as well, but I think she does some work for Beasley Allen.
Okay, all right. I just follow her on Facebook a little bit, but
yeah, she does some work for them, and she's also in solo practice as well.
I know Hayden's smart, and I would assume that you're pretty smart as well. But how did you find law school? Was it difficult academically?
Well, it was kind of like maybe the difference in college and pro ball or something. Everybody in law school is at some level of smarter. They wouldn't be there. Kind of like it on the pro football.
Right.
They got to be somewhat good or they wouldn't be there.
Right.
Doesn't mean they're the smartest tool in the shed, but it means they're there. Right. But there's also people that you would expect would go in there and just blow the doors off of it. They'd be so smart, but they just couldn't do it. And then there'd be people that you would never think that would be able to pull it off, and they'd come out of there, doing really well. To me, when I was there, after the first few weeks, and you find out you're responsible for those, and it sinks in you're responsible for those loans. My thought was they're going to have to throw me out because, I'm going to make it one way or the other because,
Right.
I don't want to be stuck having to pay all of that back and not have a source of income to be able to do it. So.
Well, now, most of us non-lawyers, most of what we know about lawyers is we see it on TV, Perry Mason. But I'm just going to take a wild guess here that probably 75 or 80% of what you do, if not more, is non-courtroom activity.
It's hard to put a percentage on that. I mean, I do a lot of court appearances because either in the criminal defense context or and at one point I even prosecuted some for Frisco City when they had a municipal court. So I've always done a pretty decent amount of courtroom appearance anyway, and I've done about 10 jury trials, and I also do guardian ad litem work.
Do you enjoy that?
I do.
The courtroom?
Yeah, it definitely is a good. You have to get a balance, between being in the office and being in court.
But some lawyers don't like it, do they? I mean, they say a high percentage of people, their biggest fear is public speaking.
Yeah.
Well, so I would think that would just petrify some people.
That never bothered. Well, when I was an undergrad, we had some set of courses there, and we basically had to give a speech in front of a large number of people in that program about once a month. And after you do that for a year, you really don't have any fear of public speaking. And once you do that for a while, and you realize that really it's you kind of own the audience. What you do with it is up to you.
Right.
You can either fall on your face, or you can try to make it something that they want to hear. It really kind of takes the fear out of that. So it's not bad. I was going to say too that another thing that, talking about public speaking, the Atmore developed a historical society and a historical preservation board and commission that approves developments in town and stuff in the historical district. So we're trying to get the word out about that as well. So that's another reason I was excited to come on your show, to let people know
that's
we're
a
out
good
there.
plug. And we've run out of time. We're just about there. Everybody worries about how they're going to talk for an hour until we get here, and I can think of probably at least 10 or 12 more things that we haven't talked about.
Yeah, it's easy. It's
maybe we could come back and do a little follow-up at a later time.
Yeah,
talk about
good.
some different things. But Kevin McKinley, he's a local guy here, coming out of Monroe County, but has a business here in Atmore. He's a practicing attorney. And read his stuff. He's on the in the Atmore magazine and in the Tri-City Ledger. Quite a historian. So
thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for coming, Kevin.
Very great.
And this is Lloyd Albritton, Lloyd and Friends. We'll see you again next Saturday.
Thanks for listening to the Lloyd and Friends Show with Lloyd Albritton.